episode 29. Dave King, you are officially the tallest guest that we've ever had on the Crazy Damn Canadians podcast.
Well, got to have some recognition here.
Absolutely. And you are the first guest we've ever had that's hiked Mount Kilimanjaro 9 times. The last guest hiked it 8 times, but 9 times is extraordinary.
Yeah.
So welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much.
And we have a lot to get into. Yeah. And before we get going, I just want to thank Mike Nash, because he was the person that put your name forward as a potential guest. And as soon as Dave and I started mentioning to friends and colleagues and our executive producer, Selin, that you were coming on, everyone was excited because they all had a story to share about you.
Oh, I hope they were tall. I hope they were good.
So let's back things up a little bit. And Dave, start off with the first question.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to give our listeners just a baseline of where you were born and.
Well, I was born in Penticton, and my parents were both, mother and father were both early. I wouldn't call them pioneers because their parents were pioneers in the area. In fact, my dad was the first male white child born in Naramata. Before there was any buildings there, he was born in a tent, and mother was, born in Penticton, but things have progressed a little bit. And my grandfather on my mother's side, he was quite involved with the Coquihalla construction of the railroad through it there, the KVR at that stage, and then continued to work for the railroad for a number of years, and eventually inherited some money and bought farmland just within Penticton, but sort of towards Naramata. And bought farmland there, and that's still in the family. Brothers and families, brothers and sisters, run it now.
Well, what a great place, a great part of the province to grow up. And was it during those early days in Penticton where you fell in love with the outdoors and adventuring and hiking?
It absolutely was. My dad was very outdoors oriented. He was a hunter, fisherman from an early age in Naramata, and knew the country well. And through the dirty 30s and things like that, he hunted and provided food, for people that had a tougher time than he did. And then he worked in the orchard business himself. He did everything from spraying to picking, irrigation, you name it, and at one stage had close to, 1,500 beehives too, raised honey and so on. Anyway, it was, he ended up working for my maternal grandfather, and that's how Mom and Dad met. And so. Well,
very entrepreneurial. Yeah. And a sign of the times as well, because you mentioned this was in the 30s.
Yes, that's right. You see, they met in the late 30s. I was born in 42, and Dad was very much involved in the fish and wildlife clubs at that stage. And in fact, he was actually one of the founders of the organization that existed before the BC Wildlife Federation existed. It started in the late 40s. And I think the BC Wildlife Federation was mid-50s or 57, something like that it was actually formed.
About a decade after that?
Yeah, it was about a decade later. And he sort of was a first president and was quite involved in that, and he got quite involved in sort of conservation-oriented things. He got to know Ian McTaggart Cowan. He was one of the first biologists in the province, and ended up teaching at UBC later. But in any case, so he got involved in conservation-oriented things quite early on, and in fact, Dad actually came up here when the Kinney Dam was being built in 1950, and ranted and raved about all the impacts it was going to have on fish and wildlife. And he was one of the very few people that did that, and was accused of treasonous activities, and was sort of threatened with jail and everything else, and the Stalaco ban that was there. I mean, they were arguing against it, but they were totally ignored, and Dad was ignored too. But it goes back to those years, and so that's my sort of interest in outdoors and wildlife and conservation and all that kind of thing goes back that far.
Well, a couple of things there is one, what a different era compared to today. And Dave and I, we had a guest, Clarence Boudreau, who we were speaking about before the podcast, and he was telling us about growing up in Penny during the 30s and 40s, and as a human being living in that era, you were just forced to develop skills in a variety of areas. It wasn't like today where you might have one career path and that's your skill set, which might be a soft skill.
Right.
It was a bunch of hard skills, whether it's being a mechanic or just knowing how to hunt and fish. Like all of these different skills, people had to be very diverse, and that was just a sign of the times back then.
Well, in farmland and in orchards, you ran machinery, you managed people, and all kinds of things, all kinds of different skills. And I mean, I was barely old enough to walk before I was doing things, like probably looking after some irrigation or something else on the farm, or looking after the chickens. We always had high numbers of chickens, feeding them, or it was wood heat, so you're cutting firewood, those kind of things from an early age. So all kinds of sort of things, and many of my close friends at that time, they were similar, growing up in the farms, and most of them went into trades. But I hesitated about that, and I finally, was convinced to go to UBC, and so I decided I would go there. And then I really was looking for something that was outdoors oriented, mining, forestry, wildlife, and so on. And as time went on, it got more and more sort of wildlife, and so I ended up with a degree in wildlife.
So was that when you were around 17 that you made the move down to Vancouver?
Probably 18. I actually took a grade 13. Yeah, and that was really the first time was the first or second time I'd been to Vancouver. I'd never seen a big city until then. So that was kind of interesting to sort of get used to that. And
I'm actually reading a book right now from Prince George, a very legendary Prince George entrepreneur, Kurt Garland. And the book is called Up Hills Both Ways. And Kurt Garland in the book talks about how he was down in Vancouver awaiting a contract on Vancouver Island, and he was staying at the Ritz. And it was 83 cents a night. And that was considered the most expensive hotel in Vancouver during the 50s.
Well,
times have changed.
I mean, I remember one year at UBC, it cost me about $1,000, and that was, accommodation at Cadia Camp, fees, everything else. It ended up $1,000 or
Yeah, and now that's a weekly rent payment.
Yeah, that's right. It cover nothing now. Oh no, it was it changed.
So how did you end up making your way up towards Prince George?
Well, while at UBC, I eventually went into a master's degree program. And I was working on blue grouse, sooty grouse, also known on Vancouver Island. And anyway, I ended up getting to know, some of the people in the Fish and Wildlife branch. And because of my father's activities with precursor to the BC Wildlife Federation, I already knew of, 2 or 3 people. Anyway, I was working on grouse and I was doing other things too, but they actually came and asked me whether I was interested in, in 1973, whether or not I was interested in coming to Prince George. And I thought about it, and I said, all right, I'll come up for a couple of years.
Everyone's planned. A couple of years is long.
Yes,
most people say
50 years later, still here.
Everybody says
That's
that
right.
universally.
But I was in the middle of the time at UBC when I decided to head off as a volunteer to Africa.
So this was during your time at UBC that the opportunity in East Africa came up?
Yeah.
And you pursued that right away?
Well, actually, I knew of the CUSO, Canadian University Services Overseas, because I had 1 or 2 friends that had joined it and it began early 60s, I guess it was. And so I sort of finished my bachelor's degree, and I'd started on my master's degree, and I did quite a bit of the field work, but I still had ways to go. And anyway, this opportunity came to go, and I originally applied to go to India because I thought that's close to the Himalayas, and I can go climbing in the Himalayas. I was quite into outdoors and hiking, climbing, that kind of thing. And I was just going off to sort of training, because they have a sort of a pre-training program before you go overseas. And they phoned up and said, gee, you are a biologist, and there's an opportunity in East Africa to teach wildlife at a college. And I said, sounds interesting. All right, let's go. So the very last minute, instead of going to Toronto, I ended up going to Montreal for pre-training for 6 weeks, and then off to Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda. It was East Africa then. It was sort of all just called East Africa.
Right around 1960 then. So you were flying then?
No, this was actually 1967.
Oh, so it was later, right, because you're going for your master's.
Yeah, it was a master's degree. I was at UBC from 61 through to 64. And worked on the master's degree, and I took a little time off here and there. But anyway, it was 67 that went off to East Africa.
Well, what a perfect location for you, because just near the border of Tanzania and Kenya is Mount Kilimanjaro.
Yeah.
Or did you research it in advance, knowing that the highest peak in Africa was where you're going?
Not at all. It really didn't have anything to do with it. It was more wildlife, the ability to see the diversity of wildlife from elephants down to everything else. It's out there, and then teaching there, because this college I was at is Moyker Wildlife College. It was set up because even after most British colonies went independent, the wildlife departments and the parks departments are still being managed by Brits. Because there wasn't trained people to sort of manage the game departments and park departments.
And was there some German influence as well?
Well, in Tanzania, yes.
Yeah.
But the last few years before independence, it was really under British control there. Anyway, so this college was set up to train, in most cases, employees are already working in these departments in a whole bunch of African countries. There's about 15 of them. And they would come to this college as long as they spoke at least some English, could understand some English, because the instruction was in English. They came to this college, and there was about 10 of us as instructors. One of them was Pat Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway's, one of his sons. And he and I were really good friends for a long time. And there was a couple from Germany, a couple from different countries, France, Americans, a couple Americans, and so on. And I still keep in touch with one or two of them. Most of us have passed away, shall we say, but there's 2 or 3 of us that still keep in touch and so on. But anyway, it was training Africans to look after their own game departments and so on, and that was sort of management skills, different things like that. And many of them had came and never been to a big city. I remember once taking a group up to Nairobi, and most of them had never been to a big city, had never been in an elevator. I took them out to the international airport and managed to, their concept of a plane that people came on as tourists was this little thing way up there in the sky. And so I took them out there and managed to get them so they could go up onto one of these big, it wasn't a 747, but it was, it was a really big Boeing plane. Things like this, so they just introduce them to sort of more of the tourism and management of tourists, and and how they thought tourists came and what they were sort of expecting. And there was quite a bit of biology taught too, so they understood biology, but different species and so on. So there was quite a bit of research activities going on. Everything from what we call grouse here, but francolins and different things, to rhinos and elephants and so on. And so we spent about half the time in the classroom and about half the time out in the fields doing field work with the students.
What an experience that must have been for you.
It was wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
And for you just to take that initiative and say, if you're looking back at yourself in Vancouver in your early 20s and just going for that opportunity, where a lot of people might be afraid to take that step, saying, okay, well, I'll go to East Africa then, or even the Himalayas.
I certainly had my reservation, but, I was willing to go for it.
But you went through with it.
Oh, I went through.
And you mentioned rhino, and the reason why that stands out to me is because Mike Nash wrote this amazing article. Actually, there was 3 articles in total, which he sent to us before the podcast. And in there, he didn't elaborate, but he said that you had an encounter once with a rhino, once with a lion. Did you want to talk about that?
Well, I had encounters with many different things, but with the rhino, I think the article that Mike wrote included incident when I was going down a back road, narrow back road, and went around a quick corner, and turns out with a mud hole right close to the road, and rhino was in it. And I had no escape. It came out of it and slammed into the side of the Toyota Land Cruiser type vehicle I was driving. You know, that was, you know, a bit much. And I mean, that was just, you know, rhino. You know, that wasn't the most threatening thing to me or in any way whatsoever. The incident with the leopard that I think Mike quoted was, this was in the Ruwenzori Mountains, or Mountains on the Moon, on the Uganda-Congo border. That's right. And a group of us went in there, and we hiked in, and we were going in for a couple, 10 days or so. And we stayed in this sort of, it was a small cabin, but it was overhanging rock, and the only trail in and out of it, there was just one trail. And about 100 feet out from where we were actually staying, there was a small creek, and that was a water source. Well, 2 or 3 people went out to the water source first thing in the morning, and came back, never said anything, and finally one of the ladies was along, she came running back, oh, there's a leopard right on the other side of the creek. I think it had to have been there, and the others didn't even notice it, you know. Anyway, for an hour, we sat around, what are we going to do? We can't even go anywhere, you know, this leopard is right there, and it's the only route out. So 3 of us decided that we'll take our ice axes and go up and hopefully, you know, scare the leopard away. Well, we walked right slowly up, right up to the creek, and the leopard was laying in a crouch position about as close as your cameras are, right there. and I was total blackout. I have no recollection of it at all. But the next thing I knew, that leopard was right on the other side of the creek at my feet. And I have no mental recollection of it leaping and landing right there, virtually at my feet. And the other 2 were hightailing it, screaming and running back. Yeah, and there I was standing there. And I think if I had reacted in the same way, it would have been on my back.
Yeah.
And just very fortunate that I didn't.
That you stood your ground.
I stood my ground. Well, we
inadvertently.
Yeah, inadvertently, because I have just no total memory of it at all. You know, never didn't then, and I don't to this day.
What did it do?
Well, we stood and looked at each other for what seemed like a long time, probably 3 or 4 minutes, and I finally decided that I tried backing up. So very carefully I took a half step backwards, and then another slowly a back step backwards, going backwards very slowly, and keeping an eye on the leopard. And wanted to make sure I didn't trip, because I knew it was roots and rough ground and all the rest of it. It wasn't nice ground. And I backed up, and I backed up probably 4 or 5 feet, very slowly. This took several minutes, and maybe 5 minutes even. And then the leopard finally got up and walked off.
Now that is the epitome of patience right there. Well, how many people could do that? Just slowly back up.
That's right. But you mentioned the lion. I was actually camping with Pat Hemingway and his daughter at that time, and we were just the 2 of us out in Tsavo National Park. And early one morning we heard the lions coming, roaring as they do, and when they're hunting. And anyway, we were just staying in tents. And one lion came right, a small tent, 2-person tent, fly on it. And it actually came under the fly of the tent, and at that point roared.
Oh, yeah. You know what's funny is we were up Fang Mountain.
Yeah.
One of the mountains, one of the trails you built.
Yeah.
Was that last year?
Yeah.
And we were sitting on the top enjoying a bite to eat, and Scott said, I'm going to go up just a little bit further up to this peak. We were on the very top looking over the backside into Sandy Mountain area.
Yep, yep.
And we're all eating, facing forward, looking at the beautiful valley, and all of a sudden Scott's just running down the hill towards us, and I'm like, what's Scott running for? And he's like, grizzly, grizzly, grizzly. And it wasn't 100 yards behind us. Not one of us heard it.
Yeah.
Not a rock, not a sound. We just turned around and looked. There's a grizzly. We all stood up and we're like, down the mountain.
Well, I've had close incidents with grizzlies, and and I've mentioned Mike Menashin. It was up in that same area. It's the old Torpy Trail that goes up on the south side of Fang Peak, and then you can go up, from that trail up to the summit too. But just as you're getting into the subalpine, there's one point where the trail you can go left or right around this fairly large. I think it's a subalpine fir, not a spruce tree. Anyway, Mike chose, he was in front, and there was more people behind us, but we were the 2 front ones. And he chose to go around the right-hand side of it, and a little noise, and at that moment, I saw and he saw a grizzly on the other side of the tree. It's just 15 feet away, and it turned out it had 3 cubs.
Oh no!
It was a mama with 3 cubs, and encountering grizzlies, I've had many incidents over the years, and they sort of moved, eventually got up and moved off, and no threat. But I think there's far more close encounters with wildlife than people ever realize. And for the most part, with grizzlies, I don't see them as a particular threat unless, as in the case with George Evanoff, he walked onto one that had a dead moose and was feeding on the dead moose, and they're very defensive of a food supply. And then
And that's Bear's Paw Ridge?
And it's on Bear Paw Ridge,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I was, led the hunt for George, the search for George, and found fresh grizzly bear tracks, and oh boy, strong suspicions. And this was middle of the night, because we were searching in the middle of the night, and we radioed back to Mike, and he was in town, and he had already been making contact with RCMP and search and rescue and so on. So,
and Mike could have very well been with them that day, right?
Oh,
he
yes.
decided to go to Viking Ridge instead.
That's right. He had been out on a hike. I think it was Viking Ridge or Sugar Bowl, and he came home a bit exhausted, so he didn't go with us. And there were 3 of us, and I was the leader of that group. And anyway, we continued searching all night. Came out and met the searchers. And they, very quickly, based on the information we provided, with helicopters and so on, went in and landed at one small meadow. It wasn't very far away, and RCMP and so on. I'd actually flew with the RCMP to give them orientation from the air, and told them where to land and about where this, tracks were and so on, because I hadn't seen the dead moose. I mean, I'd been within less than 100 meters of it, but I didn't know that.
So you were at risk.
You were at that same level of risk.
Oh yeah, but not. I didn't walk to it. We walked, past it.
And
but
how often does that happen when you're out in the bush and you just don't know?
You don't know
what you're walking past.
You guys were doing Driscoll this past weekend. How many times may you've been around a grizzly bear within 50 meters and didn't even know about it?
Well, at this time of the year, they're in hibernation, so it's not much of a concern. I mean, grizzly den is named because a grizzly den had a den on the side of Leprechaun Ridge, just right close by, right there. And it was there for 2 or 3 years, and the reason that grizzly den is called grizzly den, and that was back in the early 70s when the cabin was built, in that era.
So when you're searching for George Evanoff, and I love the book title for the biography that Mike Nash wrote about him, The Mountain Knows No Expert.
Yeah.
Because it's so true. George Evanoff was probably one of the most skilled and experienced outdoors men in the world.
Yeah.
And here he is succumbing to the actual mountain with a grizzly bear.
Well, he was out hiking by himself that day, and he was supposed to be home for a dinner party of some sort, and that happened. And I mean, I still hike alone. And I still do not carry a bear spray most of the time. I have it, but I don't always carry it.
Why is that?
Well, I sort of pay attention to what's out there, and in terms of bears, the only thing I feel I would ever be really threatened by would be if I came on a kill. I've walked in grizzly bear cubs up a Red Mountain, for instance, up in one of the meadows and alpine areas there once. I went and climbed Bald Mountain by myself and came back, and in the subalpine, there was a few scattered trees, but really scattered, and encountered a grizzly bear cub 100 feet from me, in front of me. Look around, no mama, where is she? I think I would have found out in a hurry if it squealed or made any noise, but it didn't. And so I eventually decided, down below me it dropped off huge cliffs, and I wasn't going that way, and I didn't really want to go up onto the ridge top either, but I was looking like it was going to be the option. But the cub finally decided to run up the slope, and it went behind one small little tree. That's all it was there, just a small little tree. And it was still only 150 feet from me. So I decided to keep on going. never did know where Mama was. If there was a hollow in the ground behind the small tree and Mama was there, she never, put in appearance, or she was somewhere else. I don't know. Yeah. But there was this grizzly bear cub.
Just by itself.
By itself, the cub of the year. I mean, it was, not that old.
I really want to ask you about some of these incredible local trails that you've created around the Prince George area, but let's just back it up to Africa and talk about Mount Kilimanjaro, because this is the highest peak, I believe, around 58 or 5,900 meters above sea level in Africa. And it's interesting because it's freestanding mountain. It's not like, say, if you ended up in the Himalayas where you have all these major peaks that are part of a mountain range. So here we are looking at Mount Kilimanjaro, and it's an actual dormant volcano as well,
it is.
Right? Yeah.
It's dormant, that's what it is. It's actually fumes coming out of the top up there. And yes.
So when did you first find out about this legendary mountain and think to yourself, I need to go hike this?
Well, the college actually was at the base of the mountain. It was on the south side in Tanzania. There's a town of Moshi there. And about 10 kilometers out of Moshi is where this college was based, up on the actual slope of Kilimanjaro at about 4,000 feet, 4,500 feet maybe, somewhere on there. And so the mountain was right behind. And the college with the students went up the mountain. There was a trail, it's known as the Moyker Trail, that started, and you continued up the road a little further, and then you went off, through farmland, and there was all kinds of small towns, call it towns, all the way, communities, African communities all the way around the base of the Kilimanjaro, and this trail went right up through and then on up. And before I even came up at around 11,000 feet, there was a hut built, and it became known as a Moyka hut. And so we would go up there quite often, just for students, this kind of thing. So it was right there. And one of the trips, and this route it was sort of a route, it wasn't really a trail then, it continued on up till it went all the way to the top. And in those days, the top of Kilimanjaro was still covered in ice. You look at your picture there, you can't see any ice on it.
A lot of the glaciers are melted.
Glaciers are melted. I mean, it's still, even then, some of the glaciers had wasn't as much as when the Germans first climbed the mountain in the early 1900s. But there was still lots of ice, and the route up to the top went between two glaciers, two big icy walls of ice. And anyway, I certainly was up with other staff and students on my very first trip, but it wasn't soon thereafter I decided to go up by myself, and I was just going to go for a weekend and go up. And so I ended up feeling good. I went all the way up to about 15,000 feet, camped overnight, and then decided to go to the top the next day. And so it was 27 hours from the time I left the college until I was on the top doing a solo climb. Wow. And
most people are doing this between 5 and 9 days.
Oh, absolutely. But I had been on the mountain enough. I was sort of reasonably climatized already.
So no altitude sickness?
No, I had no issues at all. And I've been to Himalayas and many other places since. Those elevations, I've just never really suffered from altitude sickness. So anyway, that wasn't my first ascent, but I did that solo ascent. But the first ascent, as I say, was in the fall of 1967. Not that long after I, arrived there in early October, as a teacher and instructor, and so I spent a lot of time on the mountain, and I even did some research on a bush hiker. It's up on the mountain, and go back up there. So in terms of days on the mountain, I really have never tried to total that up, but it's it's in weeks, shall we say. It wasn't just in days, but say over the years, I've had 9 trips when I've actually been to the summit.
Wow. And you go back?
Yeah, okay. And twice I've taken groups from Prince George here out.
Yeah. And if you were to look at the late 60s, 67, like over 50 years ago, Mount Kilimanjaro was a lot different than it is now. Like right now, they say around 30,000 people a year try to ascent or make to the top, and only half of them do. There's a 50% failure rate.
Yeah, there's a high percentage don't make it.
And then, but back in '67, I mean, the tourism probably hadn't exploded yet.
No,
Sometimes you could even have the mountain maybe to yourself or
well,
with a few groups.
Yes, and you could roam around at freedom. It was not a national park then or anything else. You just went and you did your thing, whatever you wanted to do. And even then, though, people, probably half the people that tried it didn't get to the actual top, Uhuru Point. But, again, altitude sickness, because most people around 10,000, 11,000 feet start to have impacts. 3,000 meters, 3,500 meters start to have impacts of altitude. And you got to be careful after that. And I was always very lucky until really only my last trip did I ever have any real altitude issues.
And I was surprised how many people actually die on the mountain every year.
And
immediately I thought, okay, well, tourists might be ill prepared, but there's actually a lot of porters, a lot of people from the area that are helping tourists up that might be ill equipped. And they are 75% of the actual deaths. They represent 75% of the deaths.
Well, if there's that many, I didn't realize that or didn't know that. It is mostly, I've been certainly aware of people that have died on the mountain, from altitude and a couple of falling accidents and so on.
And rock slides.
Rocks, things like that. But I think even accidents are rare. It's mostly altitude related.
Yeah. And I mean, you're getting high up there because it's 58 or 5,900 meters.
Yeah.
But if you were to compare that to Mount Robson, I believe Mount Robson's around 3,000.
It's 12,000. What is it? 400 feet, something like that. So
So
I mean, that is sort of foothills on Kilimanjaro.
Yeah, exactly. So 3,900 meters is Mount Robson. But to put it in perspective for our listeners or watchers, if you were to look at Mount Everest, that's around 8,900 meters from sea level.
Almost 30,000 feet.
Yeah,
this is 20,000 and Robson's 12.
Yeah.
So the last time you actually hiked Mount Kilimanjaro was just a few years ago.
Well, 2017. And I went out at that time because it was 50 years after my first ascent. And I wanted to make a ascent to the top. And I have kind of an irregular heartbeat now. And anyway, I did struggle a bit. I got up onto the rim of the top. Still a half kilometer from the actual highest point. I got up to what is known as Stella Point. And it's still a half kilometer around the rim and a couple hundred feet higher where Uhuru Point is. And I decided I don't want to put everybody at risk and put myself at risk. So I decided not to do that last half kilometer. The other three with me, all from Prince George here, did go to the top. But I was struggling that day.
That's how you survive, though. Is having the knowledge inside to not do what so many men do. Which is push. But knowing that's how you've made 80 years of age.
Well, probably it's probably helped. I think you got to say that genetics has, I guess, been fairly favorable too, and I've been lucky over the years not to have serious debilitating accidents of any sort. Certainly had near misses.
Did you take the same trail up throughout many of your climbs? Because I believe there's 4 or 5 different ways to get to the top.
Oh, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 or 6 major routes. Most people, I mentioned the Moyker Trail, and that one's fairly direct. That one is not a route that people can go up. It's a downhill route only nowadays.
Oh, okay.
So what they're doing now is there's about 1, 2, 3, 4. There's still about 5 trails you can go up. And they really try to have people take 3 to 4 days going up, kind of minimum. More is better, but 3 or 4. And hold people around between say around 4,000 meters elevation, and have people sort of that elevation up and down for a couple days to get acclimatized. And it really does make a difference. It really does
fantastic.
help.
Well, one thing we were talking about on our elevator ride up to the studio here with Selin is just your shared love for Africa, because Selin's made trips there. You spent a lot of time there, but you also spent time in Africa as well, Dave. What are some of your other favorite memories that stand out from your time in Africa?
Well, I've actually, eastern half of Africa, from Egypt all the way to South Africa, I've virtually been almost every country. Mozambique, I haven't been there, and Madagascar, and that was, actually we were hoping to go last year, but couldn't. But Western Africa, I really haven't seen much of that. But East Africa in itself really has a diversity. You know, it's got a lot of wildlife to be seen and so on. South Africa is really good too. You know, in terms of going to see wildlife, Kruger National Park, and other areas. Namibia, we really liked Namibia and Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. It's again, Namibia is a very dry country. It's more on the western side of southern part of Africa there, and Ethiopia is sort of an area of springs and so on, and it really collects the wildlife in the dry season, and wonderful there. Botswana, another one, really liked. Oh yeah, I mean,
I think that it's important.
Different things in different countries to some degree.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that we're at the point where we're 45 minutes in on Africa, and I really don't want to miss the opportunity to hear a little bit about some of the hikes you've built. And so I think if I guarantee Scott's got them down in his notes, written down the hikes that you built. But from my memory, you are part of building Fang, Caledonia Mountain,
Viking Ridge for sure.
Yeah, and I don't know if they didn't attribute Sugar Bowl to you. Were you part of that one?
Not the original Sugar Bowl Trail was put in by the early stages of the Prince George Naturalists. Blake Dickens played a key role in that. But it did go straight up, and I did relocate a good chunk of it to make it, put it on better ground. And yes, the upper half of the trail, I would say I relocated it and opened it up, yes.
I call Sugar Bowl the Great Suck, and when people ask for a description of the trail, I just say up.
Yes, it
just
is. Yes.
Up. That's the only description that you need for Sugar Bowl. It's just more up.
And you made it less steep? I didn't know that was possible.
Yeah, it's just up.
It made it sort of wandered a little bit more, so and also avoided some of there was a couple spots where basically the trail turned into creeks, and ditches and so on, coming straight down, and tried to find places so that the trail, was not a creek. But the Viking Trail, full credit for that one. Located it and did a lot of other people helped clear it out in the end, but I would say that I could take full credit on that one.
Can you describe what it's like then, so that we understand, we can use this for all the different trails, because nobody has a clue. How was the trail built back then? What was the amount of work? Give us a description of one.
Well, okay, a Viking Trail is a good example. In those days, there wasn't much in terms of regulation. You went out and searched. If we'd been up hiking, we really liked it, and we thought, gee whiz, we'd like to have a trail up there, but where? So I go out and you spend, a few different days wandering back and forth across the hillsides where you want, about where the trail you'd like to put it, but trying to find a location. When it's reasonably dry, it's not too steep, avoids, different things. And we also knew, even in those early days, that it had been an area that was hunted by the indigenous people, like Litene probably. I had a trail up that came from about the mouth of Hungry Creek. And Highway 16, crosses it. And I looked at that location of the old trail. But as I say, it began at the beginning of Hungry Creek. Well, where it went up, some of it wasn't all that nice. So I decided, let's see if I can find a better route. And then, so I found this alternate route, and I thought it was better. So the very top piece of the trail, before you get into the meadows on the Viking Trail, actually does utilize a short piece of the original trail, and that original trail was also used by guide outfitters and trappers and so on, because they came by boat along the Fraser, offloaded where the old spot was, and then followed the trail up. And it was even used by horses a little bit.
You can see the meadows in the background there that you're talking about. So in the
yes, that's the meadows in the
photo.
background.
Yeah, and you go off the back edge of that and down into the valley.
Yes,
the Fraser.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you see, and then early on, we wanted to bring the trail up to this lake. And we spent a long time trying to find a dry route to do that. Well, back and forth. Well, we ended up with the trail that's there. But there's no dry route. And so, like this past summer, The Caledonia Ramblers applied for park enhancement monies from BC Parks and got the money, and so we purchased lumber for plankway, so we call it boardwalk, but it's 2 boards wide, and cedar lumber, because we know that'll last a long time if you put it, down on wet ground. And some parts of the trail, because of the heavy use, were turning into mud holes. People are going all over the place trying to avoid the mud, and the trail was getting wider and wider. And so we put in the end, 500 feet of, call it plankway, through portions of this really muddy trail. And Parks is quite happy with that, and would certainly hope that we can do it again next year. And so we've already got lumber under order for next year to do another 500 feet.
I find it remarkable that you're still so active in the building of these and maintenance of these trails, and not just Viking Ridge, but you were out at Fang Mountain this past summer.
Yeah. Well, this summer the Fang Trail that George Evanoff and I, that was actually where we got to really know each other. I was searching for a route up. There had been an old guide outfitters trail that went up a ridge line, and it wasn't all that great. And we, by then, knew about the caves up there, and we wanted a route that sort of took you more to where the Fang Cave is. And so I sort of searched out a route, and George started searching out a route, and we met, and we ended up deciding on, all right, this is where the Fang Trail is going to go. So we got busy and we cut it out. And, it was just another one of those trails, in those days, as I say, you just went ahead and did these things. Yeah. You didn't have to go and get permits from anybody in Forest Service. It was Forest Service Recreation in those days.
And what a great way to get to know somebody. If you're heading up into the mountains together, you're probably spending a couple of days out there when you're researching and looking for that trail route.
That's it. And and trail into Viking Meadows, or not Viking Meadows, but the Vineyard Meadows was another one of mine. Yeah. Caledonia is totally mine too.
How long did it take to build one?
Well, really, there's a lot of dependence on that. But if you're just cutting out the deadfall and sort of making a route, a couple of kilometers a day is usually about what you can do with a chainsaw. Oh, yeah. And it depends how much you run into. I mean, you can get into it can be even slower than that, but a couple of kilometers a day. So if you had 4 kilometers of trail, 2 days is going to do the fundamental part of the work. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. It was evident.
As I say, as you say, I'm still out there doing it. This year, I probably, even despite COVID and everything else, it probably was out more than 40 days, 45 days doing trail work. Wow. Clearing deadfall, clearing brush,
And that's really hope.
All kinds of different trails.
That Dave and I both agree. If there's any hope for this podcast, is that people to realize how much work goes into the maintenance of these trails, and it's all volunteerism for the most part.
It's all volunteer, absolutely. BC Parks has helped out and sort of provided a little bit of resources for covering gas costs and so on. But recreation sites and trails, because 80% of our land here is managed by recreation sites and trails. It's not in BC Parks, and so most of the trails are actually on forest crown land. And so that most of these areas, we're dealing with recreation sites and trails, and they provide us with some money to cover travel costs, gas costs. And in fact, the chainsaw we have now, they actually bought it for us too, because the one we had was 25 years old, so the newer chainsaw we have is working quite nicely. The old one still works, but the Alexander McKenzie Heritage Trail down there, we've had a partnership agreement with BC Park, or with Recreation Sites and Trails for a number of years to maintain it. And the first 60 kilometers or so, we maintain it, and it's terrible because it goes through what was former pine stands. They were, it was killed by a pine beetle, and all those trees are falling down now. Mm-hmm. And it's changed the forest complex, so the wind gets in there now and is blowing down some of the spruce trees and the cottonwood trees and other things that are in there. So you can get terrible tangles of, not very strong winds of trees that have come down because of storms on some of these trails.
And it doesn't take much. Were you with the Caledonia Ramblers crew that went out to Mount Pope about 10 days ago?
No, I wasn't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because my girlfriend and I did it
Yeah.
about 5 days after the Ramblers were
Yeah.
out there, and there was a big storm. There's
Yeah.
probably about 30 trees that were down. So it can happen like that.
Absolutely, absolutely, it can. And we have looked after that mountain trail off and on over the years. But recently, there has been somebody based in Fort St. James has been largely looking after the Fort.
Did you have anything to do with the Monkman, or did you ever hike the Monkman Memorial Trail? Do you know that trail?
I have hiked most of it, not all of it, but I've been into Monkman Lake, 3 or 4 times in club trips. We've gone in there for week-long trips, and hiked. I've actually hiked up the trail from the bottom end a ways.
On the river, on the McGregor River?
No,
from the other end?
No, from Canoosal Falls down. Oh, okay, you're talking about the trail that cooks right through to the McGregor?
Yeah.
No, I never have. I never have been through that. But that...
you might have been thinking Tumbler Ridge area.
Yeah.
It goes from the McGregor River to Tumbler Ridge. It's called the Monkman Memorial Trail. It's a 5-day hike, 80 some odd kilometers.
Yes.
Is that on your bucket list? Or?
I did it.
Oh, you did it?
It was hell.
Well, I was going to say, there's a big chunk of it hasn't been maintained,
in years.
Down to Fontanico, getting across the Herrick. I don't know how you got across the Herrick.
You literally, it was
Yeah.
hell.
Yeah.
I came home with feet that were just one big blister.
Yeah.
And we got helicoptered out from the top of the mountain. When we finally made it to the top, we phoned a helicopter and got picked up.
Wow.
Because we were dead. Coming out of that bush, you basically just bushwhacked through the BC bush with no trail.
Did you go up? You went up the Fontanico. You crossed the Herrick and went up the Fontanico. Then did
We
you?
got dropped off right on the edge of the McGregor River.
Oh, okay.
Just off the shore. And
Oh,
he dropped
okay.
us off just on the other side of the Herrick Creek, I believe.
Okay.
Probably, if that connects to it. Or, anyways,
Okay.
Herrick Creek comes down, and that goes up to...
Herrick is what you have to cross there, and
Yeah.
it's really a river. It's not. It's far more than a creek.
Yeah, yeah.
And
There's
even
a cable
under,
car, isn't there?
No, there's nothing there. There was a bridge across years ago, but there's been nothing for many, many years, and they may be going back up there logging soon, and maybe it'll reopen again. But there was one fellow that came through from the Tumbler Ridge side over the Monkman Pass and then down there, and was ruined there for about 10 days because you couldn't get across. And he was out of food and everything else. And very fortunately, somebody came up on a boat and he waved and he managed to, he got out. But otherwise, he may have, survived, because it really is a river. I mean, getting across the Herrick isn't, is really something.
All this talk about the backcountry and the hikes in the vicinity makes you realize how lucky we are to live in such a beautiful part of the world, and BC is just beyond outstanding. But one area that a lot of people that are listening or watching this podcast will know very well is the ancient forest.
Yes.
And you had a role in that as well?
Oh, absolutely. There's various people, and Mike Nash again played a lead role in that, and sort of searching out routes to get up on top of Driscoll Ridge, because it's right off of Highway 16. And I was part of that too. And in the end, it was decided that one of the trails that we'd like to build would start where the current parking lot for the ancient forest is. But in those days, it was just a little road in off into a little bit of a gravel pit just in a short distance.
No signage or
no, nothing at all. And around that same time, Save the Cedar League, that was based out in Crescent Spur area, Rick Samoto, he was really keen on preserving this old growth cedar forest, and he had been doing it for some time, and I knew him even through my days working with Fish and Wildlife as a biologist. And but none of us sort of really appreciated the ecological significance of the cedar forest there at that stage. And it was late 90s when Darwin Cox and UBC started really sort of researching the area too. And one of his students, name just goes out of my head right at this moment, got involved and did some research out there. Rady's tree, Dave Rady's. He went in and found this really large tree, cedar, and anyway, there was then we had hemlock hemlock looper attacked out in that area, but it also not only this was early 90s, and not only attacked the hemlock and killed some of that, but it also attacked the cedar also, and sort of defoliated huge area of cedar right there. So the government actually issued a salvage permit to a company in McBride, and they actually laid out a cut block just right in where that parking lot is up there, and it was block 486, and there was a film actually made on it. And so on, but anyway, it sort of was getting some sort of publicity, you know, tried to save, you know, some of these cedar stands.
So they were ready to log.
Yeah. Anyway, that was sort of it. And anyway, the group from McBride, they were talking in terms of maybe opening up a nature trail. This was about 2005, and it was right when then we started looking at a trail up onto Driscoll Ridge. Not thinking in terms of the preservation of the forest at all. Anyway, the fellow who was in charge of sort of forest recreation and trails at that time in Forest Service said, let's handle both of these applications together because they're both starting from the same point. They got them at the same time. And Caledonia Ramblers ended up being the body who was, you know, handling, you know, sort of the pushers, you know, for the trails and so on. Anyway, it was around 2005, 2006 when Recreation Sites and Trails was formed, and the government reorganized itself and so on, and so it switched over there. But in the end, both trails were approved under Caledonia Ramblers' name, this nature trail, and also a trail up, you know, to the mountaintop. This would be the East Driscoll Trail now. Anyway, so it was really Noel Sr. and myself. We went out one day and with chainsaw and started cutting the current trail, the main trail in the ancient forest. And we sort of varied it, you know, there was a few ribbons sort of marking a bit of a route, but we sort of said, oh, it's too wet here, let's go there. And, you know, we varied the route, and it was CNI. And CNI that sort of worked on sort of establishment of everything ever since then. We made a presentation to the regional district at one stage. They said, oh, this is out in forest lands, too far from the community. So I, you know, started talking with our MLA, Shirley Bond, and the first time I talked with her, she said, no way, we can't get a park here. It's you know, it's forest values, might be mineral values, there's gravel pits, you know, this kind of thing, and no way. But as time went on, and Noel and I, we continued sort of working the trail and developing it, and people sort of found out about it. There's no publicity, it was just word of mouth. And
the best publicity.
Yeah, and it sort of became, you know, and some of the industries and the forest mills shut down in McBride, and McBride was sort of, you know, they saw it as an opportunity to attract tourists. Yeah. People going to the ancient forest because of the trails there. Yeah, we really didn't call it ancient forest then. It was, you know. But anyway, it's evolved from there.
There is a huge opportunity that I don't think people are aware of. When you just described that, it just hit me. As they do all of this conversation about increasing tourism to northern BC, there is a massive movement around the world, and COVID initiated it, where people are looking for recreation, the grouse grind, heading into all of Squamish.
Oh, absolutely.
And we have a series of the best hikes you can do without millions of people on them. And if you want to increase tourism in Prince George and northern BC, that's the opportunity to bring dollars into the community, is just market these trails and then get the government to put more money into them to enhance them and make them safe as much as you can. I mean, you know, the grouse grinds, you're still going to fall if you're going to fall, but you can make them safer and put rails where they're needed and
and over the
mud. But you see, with the ancient forest, you know, after we had this sort of nature trail there for a couple of years and people were sort of using it, Noel was helped out with handicapped kids at schools, you know, and that was sort of his role. And he was bringing kids out there and discovered that, you know, some of the really physically handicapped ones couldn't handle the trail. You know, it was just too much for them.
Hence the boardwalk.
And since we started talking about maybe we need, and there was other people that needed wheelchairs and things, and you know, so we started looking, and so he and I sort of searched around. And he said, "This is probably the best, you know, where the boardwalk is now. It's probably the best location for it." So we went after that, and Noel certainly did most of the paperwork and pushing for funding and so on. But it was he and I that really pushed it, and the boardwalk. I'd say 90% of it. I built the foundation for virtually 90% of it. That's the posts that held it upright and everything else. A lot of other people put the decking on and the railing, but the actual foundation for it, I would say at least 90% of that I actually constructed it myself. And then the plankway was a trail for quite a few years, but I realized that there's muddy sections here and there, and the trail was getting to be 20 feet wide because people are trying to avoid the mud in their sandals and little running shoes and so on. So we said we just got to put down some plankway or something. So we started doing that. So we spent 3 years doing that. Probably 80% of that I probably installed.
Well, I think it's critically important for people that are watching and listening to this podcast to recognize when they're on these trails and these hikes throughout northern British Columbia, to recognize all of the hard work that went in to them being accessible and them being available.
Absolutely.
Who the people behind those trails are.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, sure, I've sort of been in charge of sort of trail maintenance for the Caledonia Ramblers for a number of years, but there's other people out there, and there's many other people that help in various ways, and so many of the different trails, and it's they're not just there, they got to be maintained.
Well, there's something on the Caledonia Ramblers website that called you. Not only is your trail knowledge legendary, but also your fitness. And this is coming from the Caledonia Ramblers website. What year did you get involved with the Ramblers?
Well, I came here in 1973, and I think it was 1975 I got involved. And actually, it was trail building was one of the very first things I got involved with the Ramblers. It was a trail up what is known as Ptarmigan Creek, Erg Mountain area, where that trail was just being opened up. The trail is not accessible right now. It was washed out a number of years ago, and road access is not good, and we'd hope to get it reopened again. But anyway, it was trail work almost from the beginning. But I had been involved with trail work even when I was at UBC still with the Varsity Outdoor Club. One, the trail goes up the Lions, at UBC there. I helped, open up and construct a piece of that. And the one that goes up the Squamish, bluffs and so on. And, there's a trail up there I, did some work on too. And, a few other trails I, worked on in those days,
So where's the motivation for building these trails? Is it just knowing that thousands of people are going to be the beneficiary for the therapeutic benefits of nature and exercise?
I see opportunities. I see a good destination that be, other people get to, and make it a little easier for them to get there. I'm quite comfortable in thick bush, and you talked in terms of going through it, and I've done it, hundreds of times, and I've led groups through pretty heavy bush, and I got a good sense of direction. I always have had. And I don't need compasses and all these kind of GPSs and all this kind of stuff, but I can still do things. And to get if it's really worthwhile, I'll put a little bit of extra effort in it to open a trail up so average person can go and enjoy it. Really
well, like Dave just mentioned, there's so much opportunity in tourism for northern British Columbia that I feel a lot of it hasn't been fully capitalized on, because just last weekend when we went and did Mount Pope, mountain to ourselves, how many people did you see on Driscoll Ridge? None. And that is so rare, where if you were to go in the lower mainland or other major metropolitan areas with surrounding mountains, you're probably going to be sharing it with hundreds, if not thousands of other people. But in northern British Columbia, you can actually go out on a hike and have a mountain to yourself.
Certainly the publicity for our trails here is not, it really hasn't been a lot. I mean, there's been a little bit, but it really hasn't been what it could be. I absolutely agree with you on that. West Driscoll Trail, most of it, I could take credit for that one too. It's another one.
And it just got a highway sign this past summer, in the year 2021.
That's right, but there's going to be even a larger sign at the trailhead.
Great.
It's under development right now. We have the Prince George Backcountry Recreation Society here, and it's been around since '97, and it's sort of had really active periods and low periods, and right now we've got a very strong active group, And anyway, they've been working with BC Parks, and there's going to be a new sign put at the Driscoll.
Awesome.
We call that our training ground hike, the first Driscoll, not the second one.
Yeah, no, they have West Driscoll Trail.
Yeah, we call it our training ground because you can just go to 2.73 clicks, come to a little landing, and look over the whole valley.
That's right.
So that's where we always take people first. If you can survive that, then you can can go to Viking.
Yeah.
And it's a very rewarding view for that 2.7K.
Well, it's a lovely view at that viewpoint. You see that opening there is because there was a forest fire up there many years ago. And it was a spot that was sort of cleared out. I think there must have been somebody hike up there, or somebody dropped it by helicopter and then opened up so that helicopter could land to deal with the spot fire. It was just over the ridge from there. And I think that's, but that's a lovely viewpoint, over the valley and down onto the Fraser River and so on. And that we made sure that the trail went to that spot when we put that trail in.
Yeah.
And then on the north side of the Fraser River, all the hikes that exist out there with Red Mountain and Longworth.
Longworth, two key ones.
Yeah.
But, we've been working on right now a trail up Baldy Mountain, which is sort of in between the two. And it's about 3/4 built. It's not well marked yet, but we got it almost cleared. That's one we're working on.
And then even within city limits, before the podcast, we were chatting about your involvement with Cottonwood Island and Forest for the World. What did that look like?
Well, as the Cottonwood Island, it was other people who really played the lead roles in that, not myself. But Forest for the World, I was on the original committee that really went towards trying to get the area up there established as kind of a city park. And an area with trails for residents here to use, and that was that early '80s. I've forgotten right now when it was.
Yeah, gorgeous area. I love going up there. I think everybody in Prince George does. And
Shane Lake and so on. I mean, it was a few years later before fish were put in the lake, but. It was sort of a destination, and we made certain trails, and over the years, there's been many more added to it.
Well, we're so lucky that we had advocates like you that kept it as recreational trails, because it could have been developed into something else, right?
Oh, it could have been, and in fact. It was actually, if you looked at long-term plans, it was seen for subdivision and this kind of thing, and then the university had a sort of area up there was reserved, and so that was when the university started in the early 90s, and they started to pin that down. So I had to say, all right, how is that going to be accommodated? We have the the Forest for the World area here.
Yeah, well, I think it's such a nice extension of UMBC.
It was. It was absolutely.
I was reading an article. I was talking about the original names of UMBC. They had three names. It was down to three names. One was University of the North. The other was Alexander Mackenzie University. And then the third was the University of Northern British Columbia. And that's what they ended up going with. But I thought it was interesting how they had those three names down. But I want to ask you just a quick question in regards to world travel. Because I looked at Mike Nash's article, and it probably would have been easier for him to name the countries that you haven't visited with your wife. And I just have a list of them here. So you have all the countries in East Africa: Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, South Africa, Russia, Estonia, Turkey, Mongolia, China, Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, Easter Island, Mexico, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Belize. And then you also skied in Bulgaria in the days of the Soviet Union, camped in Iceland, and have traveled extensively throughout Europe, including ski trips to destinations like Norway. What country have you not visited that's always been on your list and you wish that you did visit?
Well, I mentioned it already, Madagascar.
That would be it.
Would be one of them that would be very much like to go to.
So you think in 2022?
Well, we'll see, how health issues are and how COVID things and so on, because I just won't travel right now. I mean, it's just crazy, dealing with all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. You were just in Belize, right?
I was just in Belize, but it was a huge pain in the butt.
To travel.
Wasn't worth it going right now. Restrictions were strong. And
we actually ended up in Belize shortly after a major hurricane. And it was largely shut down, but the reefs offshore had been damaged, and there was hardly anybody there. It was just 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, and we thoroughly enjoyed it. Nobody there, and had it to ourselves, kind of thing. But the damage was certainly apparent everywhere. Yeah.
So did you get the travel bug while you're in East Africa, visiting different countries there?
That probably helped. But my wife actually had a real travel bug, even from her, when she was early 20s. She went on a summer-long trip to Europe, shaking by herself.
Nice.
And then she, in the 1960s, spent a year with a girlfriend traveling around the world. Visited 40-odd countries, and it cost her about $3,000 or $4,000 at all the cost then, for everything. That was air tickets and everything.
What an experience.
And, close to 40 countries, visited, many countries you can't go to anymore, like Afghanistan and, all kinds of different places. Yeah. So she was, really had a travel bug. Yeah. And, because I'd done some, so we, even after I actually first met Judith in Montreal, I was coming back from Africa, and she happened to be working in Montreal, and she was staying with a friend, Barb. It was actually originally from Vanderhoof, and I got to know her at UBC. And anyway, met Judith there, and anyway, she eventually moved to Prince George because she went back to Vancouver and was teaching in Vancouver and moved to Prince George. But we even during my working years, every 2 or 3 years or something, we would try to get a little bit of travel in. And I took time off without pay, and or this kind of thing to go traveling. And so we've been from the Arctic to Antarctic, and virtually all countries in South America, as you kind of listed there. And Mongolia was a real highlight. In South America, I would mark Bolivia is up at the top of my list there. I mean, there's many things in any other countries, but Bolivia has not been so corrupted by European influences. It's more, traditional native culture there still, and really like that part of it.
I think the greatest benefit from travel is the appreciation and high level of gratitude that manifests within yourself for where you call home. Yeah. Because whenever you come back to whether your home's Prince George or somewhere else, by seeing a lot of the world, especially third world countries, you're just filled with the appreciation for what you have back home. Oh,
for sure. Like I've been 4 trips to Nepal. Never trips to go climbing high peaks. So I've seen Mount Everest and many of the others that are there. But it was to do treks, month-long treks in remote, sort of off the beaten track trails area, and most of those trips with other friends in Prince George here, and friends that are still friends. And some of them went 4 or 5 times, or 5 or 6 times. We went on 4 trips, and when we first went going there, you got out of the major cities, there was no telephone, nothing. But towards the end, people were starting to have their cell phones. They were starting to sort of spread around. When I was in East Africa, the major cities had telephones and power and this kind of thing, and you maybe got some television, but you got out to the villages, that didn't exist. And it wasn't until around 2000 that things, started to spread out when you got solar panels provided electricity, and then cell phones and things started to come online. But I remember when I was working in East Africa, a couple of those I was working with said, "I'd like to take you out to our village." And I said, "Well, where am I going to stay? And what should I bring?" "Oh, don't worry about that. I'll arrange that." I said, "How are you going to get in touch with them?" "Oh, just give me a moment." Well, they use mental telepathy. They just went off into a dark corner, and they communicated. And when we arrived out there, they'd communicated by mental telepathy, and they'd set up a nice bed for me to stay in, because we were going to stay overnight, you see.
I think there's probably something more to that in the end, but I'll go with you and be a believer.
Well, it's not my only experience with that kind of thing, so I accept it.
Yeah, absolutely. Why not?
And because there is no other way for them to communicate. It's a remote village.
Yeah. Unreal.
Yeah.
So, Dave, I have one more question left, and then we always have a final question that we ask all of our guests. But I know that Mike Nash, good friend of yours, is going to be watching this podcast, and he was instrumental in having you as a guest today, which we really appreciate. Mike is somebody that when I first moved back to Prince George in 2011, I read his book, and it really did make me fall in love with the community even more, and it made me realize like how lucky we all are to call Prince George and northern British Columbia home. What was your favorite memory with Mike and Prince George? It could be hiking, it could be anything. What is one memory between you and Mike Nash that stands out for you?
Oh gosh, we certainly, were on many, hiking trips together. I mean, I mentioned this one with the grizzly bear already. Going into the Fang Cave. It was a friend of his that came out, and they went on the very first trip and into the caves, and you probably remember they got lost in there, and they're lucky to get out in that very first trip. But anyway, the second trip up there when we went and explored the Colosseum and down in there, that was quite an experience.
Is that what you call the cave, the Colosseum?
Yeah, the Colosseum. They went down into some of the main channels, both from the resurgence and where the creek runs in at the top end. But the Colosseum, they saw it, but never were actually in it. So it was the second trip that we actually got into the Colosseum. We rappelled into it and then down what we call a corkscrew down deep into it. And that was, some of those trips with Mike are, really quite memorable.
Feels like you're entering a different world when you're down there in those caves.
Yeah, for sure.
I didn't realize you could go up over the top on Fang and then go down into the creek and into the caves that way. I didn't realize that. I thought you could only go in through the hole in the top.
No, you can't actually go from the top, but it's you got to know what to do.
It'd be repelling.
That's one.
But we went in through the caves for the first time this summer. Down through the creek, and it was incredible. That's incredible.
Quite a few.
You can go in a little ways, and you can see, you get a bit of a feel for it. If the creek is down, you can get some experience. You can go a certain distance.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit.
Enough that I was nervous.
Taking in people in the upper entrance many times, just for a little bit of experience there. But if the creek is really down, where the root comes out way down below, you can actually go up the creek too, and usually have to go through some water. And if it's not too much, then you can go further, and eventually get into another whole series of chambers there. But it's still not the route that most people use to get in is through the big hole that goes into the Colosseum, and then
in the front when you're coming up the hill.
Yeah. But there's one other entrance way too I know about too. So there may be others, but I'm not really a caver. I've done a little bit of caving, not here, but elsewhere, but not really.
Well, that sounds like a phenomenal memory.
Before you just sort of close off here, I'll just mention one other thing that I just touched on briefly. I mentioned the Mountains of the Moon and the Ruwenzori Mountains.
That's right. Yeah, 8 out of 10, right?
Yeah, there's about 10 peaks that are over 16,000 feet. I think it's 8 of them I've climbed. And the day we climbed the 2 highest wings, Margarita and Alexandra, that was on Christmas Day, 1968. And that was the day when the Americans first circled the moon with one of their Apollo craft. Apollo 6 Apollo 6 or Apollo 7, I just forgotten which one it is.
And you didn't know at the time?
No, I knew nothing about it at the time we were in there, and it was a week or two later after we got out that we finally heard, the Americans circled the moon. When did they do it? Christmas Day. Oh, that's when 3 of us climbed the 2 highest peaks, the mountains of the moon.
And was it from a subsequent Apollo mission, like 16 or 17, that one of the astronauts sent you a patch?
Yes, it was in the summer, and it was in the summer of 1968 then that they landed on the moon. Armstrong, this is 2000, Apollo 17, was it? 16, somewhere around there.
Wow.
Yeah.
So our last question for you is one we ask of every single guest. And the question is, if there was any Canadian that you could talk to, living or dead, past or present, who would that Canadian be and why?
Oh, boy. That's a tough question. I should have.
It always stumps people. It really does. Yeah. It is a loaded question.
Yeah. Gosh. I mean, people like, Franklin and, some of these long ago explorers would have been interesting, or, Alexander Mackenzie, you know, people like this, I think I would put them up fairly high on, you know, on the list. I really would.
Alexander Mackenzie.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I'm going to make it a goal to hike some of that trail. I've seen it when I was out hunting, out the Blackwater, seeing the start of it. There's a sign there saying.
Yes. Well, the Alexander Mackenzie Trail, it goes through episodes of being fairly well cleared. It's not in too bad a shape right now. We look after the first 60 kilometers, but other one of the native bands out there have done a lot of work, and then there's ATVers and off-roaders and doing other sections. The one section which I'm not sure what kind of condition it is in right now, and this is the part through Tweedsmuir Park that you go over and down into the Bellacoola Valley. I was in there 2 years ago, up into that area, into the mountains, Mackenzie, and the trail was pretty awful.
Yeah.
It had not been used. Had been the forest fires. It closed the whole area down for 2016, 17, and then, you know, it was it hasn't been used, and it was really tough shape up in there.
Well, I'm with Dave. With both of you guys, with all this talking about hiking and trails, it makes you want to get out and start exploring. One bonus question, actually: what is your favorite trail around the region, around northern British Columbia? What one is at the top of the list for you?
Well, it's one I haven't talked about really right now, and this is actually Mount Isa.
I've never heard of that.
Well, it's up closer to Dease Lake, up, you know, way up Highway 37.
So it's up.
Yeah.
And you got to fly into it. Well, you can hike in, but you know, it's 2 or 3 days to actually hike in. But it's volcanic. It's relatively recent volcanic, and it's very different to anything else. So it's an area it's really interesting. And I've taken groups in there, you know, with the Ramblers groups for week-long trips 4 or 5 times, and I highly recommend it as an interesting area. I've only been to the top of the mountain once, but that's not necessary. You're well above tree line. You're up on the volcanic, you know, plains, and there's lots of little ash cones and things you can climb and so on. And there's, you know, glaciers there still.
It's like the Mount Kilimanjaro of northern BC.
In a way, that's right. And there's places there where there's even volcanic rock on top of the ice, and one place where you can go deep under the ice, and, you know, and under the ice, and, you know, volcanic ash or rock, whatever, it's on top of the ice in one location.
That's fun.
No, it's really very nice. Another one I'd always recommend if somebody wants something different to go to, and that's the Wakpash. You know, Stone Mountain area up in, you know, Fort Nelson, west of Fort Nelson off the highway there, and that's another really interesting one. It's really very interesting too.
Take a drive.
Awesome answers.
Yeah, but you know, those areas a little further away. Locally here, that's a really tough question, because, I mean, the Raven Lake, Grizzly Den area has, you know, always been a favorite, and you know.
Yeah, well, it's
Vineyard Meadows, and you know, the you know, Viking, you know, the different ones for different reasons. And
well, with all the work that you and a lot of your colleagues and friends have put into those trails over the years, it's evident how special they are to you, and they obviously hold a special place in your heart. And, you know, I just want to say thank you for putting in all the time for all those trails, because we are the beneficiaries. People of Prince George and visitors of Prince George are the beneficiaries of all your hard work, and the Caledonia Ramblers and people like Mike Nash that have been real pioneers and leaders. So thank you so much, Dave, for being a guest on Crazy Damn Canadians. It was an honor.
Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you too for inviting me. Yes.
All right, cue the Studio 720, Andrew.